Because, of course, the earth does not belong to well, the world divvies itself up into its little parts. There are expectations put upon me to think a certain way, to behave a certain way. Honestly, it's all trollop and goss nonsense, right? I don't know what it ever was anyways, but I get confused when someone talks about national values and what it is to be but as more time has gone on, more things in there have just cease to exist, cease to matter. And I find myself not particularly caring. It's funny that when I lose a thing that I never really had in the first place, it seems like the only memory that was holding me back was the belief that I had a thing. You know, that I had it in the first place. Upon realizing that I never had it in the first place, that it was never mine to lose, it doesn't particularly matter anymore. I was first in line. It was my right. Yeah, but I have no rights. And if a privilege is given to me on the condition that I behave a certain way, then it's not in point of fact that I have been given a privilege. It is in point of fact that a privilege takes a right away from me. Because if it is a right, only insofar as I behave a certain way, think a certain way, dress a certain way, talk a certain way, then it is not in fact a right, it is a privilege. And if it is a privilege, then it is something that is laid upon me. And if a privilege is something that is laid upon me, then it is not something that I've been given, it is something that is put upon me. It's a burden. It's a burden to be privileged in that sense. I guess, in essence, the reason why I consider myself to be a man without a country is namely because of the fact that a man without a country. If let's say my right to vote is stipulated upon whether or not I vote for a particular selected candidate, then it's not really my right to vote, it's my privilege of choice. If it's a right, then it's mine to do with as I see fit. If it's a privilege, it is laid upon me as an expectation that I will choose one of a pre-selected choice. One of a pre-selected option. If it is the freedom of speech, yet I am expected to speak in a certain way according to one option or another, then it is not a freedom of speech, it is a privilege of opinion. The privilege of opinion is laid upon me in that I am expected to have an opinion that aligns with either one ideal or another ideal. And what am I left with from that? If it is the right to keep and bear arms, yet I am told what kind of arms I am allowed to keep and bear, or whether or not I am in fact allowed to keep and bear arms at all, then it is not a right to keep and bear arms. It is a privilege to keep and bear arms that is laid upon me on the expectation that I concede my right to keep and bear arms. The same way that a man with a firearm has the ability to defend himself against a small intruder, so a man with the right to keep and bear arms has that right as a deterrent to those that would take from him his other rights. But if it is a privilege to keep and bear arms, then it is in fact a privilege contingent upon good behavior in other regards. In essence, it is not a right that protects me. It is not a right that protects my other rights. It is a privilege that is contingent upon my other privileges. That is to say, if I have the right to keep and bear arms, that protects my right not to an opinion, but my right to speak. The right to keep and bear arms protects my right to peaceful assembly. But if it is a privilege, and let's say I go to a peaceful rally with other people, and we assemble ourselves peacefully and well armed, then it is a right that protects us from the overreach of a government that would come with their own firearms But if it is a privilege, then if I show up to a peaceful organization with others who are likewise armed, then my privilege is in danger because I have violated those who enforce those privileges. So essentially, in order to express my privilege of the right to keep and bear arms, I must forego my privilege to peacefully assemble. I can't very well move about in peace if the other man is armed and I am not. I cannot very well guard my domain if the expectation is that I will be protected by another who has the right to keep and bear arms, while I only have the privilege contingent on good behavior to keep and bear arms. So freedom of speech becomes a privilege of opinion. The right to keep and bear arms becomes the privilege to keep and bear on condition the right to peaceful assembly becomes the privilege of gathering according to condition, and all the rest of it falls apart. For instance, held within the right to vote is the right to have my voice heard, not my opinion, according to one group or another group. See, the thing about the rights is that rights are in themselves all-inclusive, whereas privileges stand themselves alone and are thus separated, and they're thus unrelated to one another and are thus weak. But of course, I guess none of that matters. Not really. Because what I'm talking about doesn't particularly matter. The long and the short of it. Because in this country, so completely has anything resembling this country been forgotten that even I myself don't really know. So when a man talks about traditional values, I'm not certain whether or not the man is talking about traditional values or foundational values. Foundational values are, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Those are foundational values. Traditional values are, this is the way we've been doing things for some time. So, let us not have any hiccups in the operation of the continuance of this is the way we've been doing things for some time. I find it interesting that people I know, when they talk about traditional American values, they generally gravitate towards an imaginary time called the 1950s. And the only people I know that remember the 1950s were children. Or nascent adults, perhaps, if they're very much older. At this point, I know very few people that were even born in the 1940s, for instance. Fewer still born in the 1930s. I know of no one born in the 1920s. Perhaps one. Perhaps I know one person born in the 1920s. But it's interesting to me that when I read in a history book or I listen to a historical analysis, the 1950s is spoken of as the time of American greatness, the height of America. What troubles me in that is that I get the sense that the values, the traditional values of the 1950s are superimposed on the foundational values of the 1770s. Of course, with a little bit more color, perhaps. What I mean to say is that when I read those historical analyses, what comes across is that the 1770s were the immediate generational ancestor of the 1950s. But when I look at it, the time of the 1950s was a time full of turmoil and full of distress in a lot of different ways. I just have a hard time coming to terms one with the other, you know? Was it different? I don't know. I don't think it was. I don't think it was. I lost my train of thought there for a second. No, more accurately, what I'm trying to say is that all I know of the 1950s is what I've been told about the 1950s. And what I've been told about the 1950s were things told me by people who were children in the 1950s. at the very most, nascent adults in the 1950s. And when they take a time to pause and recollect, their view of the 1950s is in fact very different than what I read about the 1950s. The 60s, the 70s, the 80s, likewise. But I think it's safe to say that after enough time passes, a certain story expresses itself, presents itself, and becomes the accepted way of things. Granted, in the 1990s, I was young, sure. But if I pull the thread back just over the course of my life, and I've seen how far things have come just in that period of time, well, I can superimpose that image over what I've been told about that time. Because truth be told, I've seen I don't know if to call it the natural or the unnatural progression of events. I could say to myself, if I look at the year 2019, things were very different than they are now. But if I take the time to actually pause and reflect, I recognize that the things that were happening in 2019 are the things that ended up happening in 2020 had been working towards that breaking point for many years prior to that. Like a giant tsunami wave rolling up underneath the ocean until finally it crests. But nothing that happened in 2020 could have possibly happened had not there been decades of waves rolling underneath the surface of the ocean that directly led to that and everything that's going on right now. And if I look at that, and if I'm being honest with myself, I believed many of the things in 2010 that I believe now. The only difference being that I have given up many beliefs that I held in 2010 that I no longer believe now. In truth, if that did anything, that clarified what I did believe and do believe now. It solidified it. So if I'm looking at it, if I'm being honest, the only thing that changed was the beliefs that I held to be true that were in fact the quasi-equivalent of privileges put upon me. That is to say, they were beliefs that I held to be true because I was expected to hold them to be true. But as all of that time has gone on, and those beliefs have grown to be a greater and greater burden upon me, I have to recognize that those were not in fact beliefs that I held, but they were in fact beliefs that were put upon me in the expectation that I would behave a certain way, that I would live my life a certain way. And I thought for many years that there must be something wrong with me because I simply could not seem to grasp the actuation of those beliefs. But now I no longer hold to them. Or rather, I am no longer held by those beliefs. Because at the end of the day, those were not my beliefs. Those were beliefs that were put upon me. And those were beliefs that were put upon me contingent upon my behavior in a certain way. And as it turned out, if I did not behave a certain way, then I was not able to realize the benefit of those privileges. The privileges that came with holding to those beliefs. Which reduces me down to a nothing, really. An absolute zero. And a zero that is a man without a country. Although, of course, there is a number associated to me. There is a number applied to me, and a number by which I am still bound. Whether I like it or not. I can say what I believe to be true. I can act on what I believe to be true. But at the end of the day, it is irrelevant whether or not I hold these things to be true, these traditional truths. In my condition, I am still subject to the conditions of those privileges. But at least if I am subject to the conditions of those privileges, and I recognize them to be privileges and not rights, then at the very least I can see my prison as a prison. At least I can recognize myself to be a prisoner. At least I can look at my slavery for what it is and recognize myself to be a slave. And I can choose to accept that as a condition. And if it is in fact my condition, then at least I can strip away from myself the illusion that it is not the condition of others that matters so much, but that it is the condition of myself alone that has any real gravity or any real meaning. Because whatever I've been told, whatever I've been taught, it only counts with reference to myself. Because since it is a matter of privilege, and as a privilege separates, whereas a right joins, then at least I can recognize that I am alone. And not bear up under the illusion that I am part of some greater whole. I can recognize that I am not allowed to be an American, that I do not have the right of being an American, that only what is put upon me is the privilege of being an American. And that privilege is in no way foundational, but that privilege is merely the way things are done.